The Australian Grand Prix not only showed a spectacular race, but it left a warning for the entire Formula One. Because when it seemed that Red Bull was in trouble and that Max Verstappen was out of the fight, exactly the opposite happened. What started as an absolute disaster ended up becoming one of the most impressive performances of the beginning of the season. Now think about this for a second. What would happen if the most dominant driver of the last era of Formula One starts last on the grid, after an unexpected accident in qualifying, on a circuit where overtaking is not exactly easy? Most would think that their career is completely ruined, that all that remains is to limit the damage and wait for the next big prize. But that's not what happened in Australia. What we saw was something very different, something that left the paddock completely baffled. A patient, intelligent and surgical comeback that ended up putting Verstappen back in the fight when no one expected it. After crashing in Q1 and being condemned to the back of the grid, the Dutchman transformed a weekend that seemed lost into a performance that changed the perception of the entire season, crossing the finish line in 6th position after a constant progression lap after lap. What is impressive is not only the final result, but the message it left. Even when the car is not the fastest and the team recognizes that it is still chasing Mercedes and Ferrari, Verstappen is still capable of turning chaos into invaluable championship points. Because the big question that Australia left is not only how it managed to make up so many positions. The real question is much more disturbing for the rest of the teams. If Verstappen can do this when Red Bull does not have the best car, what will happen when the RB is fully back in its performance window? Max Verstappen's weekend in Australia started in the worst possible way, and for several minutes it seemed like we were witnessing one of those moments that completely changed the course of a Grand Prix before the race even begins. In the middle of the qualifying session, when the drivers were just beginning to find the necessary rhythm to overcome the first round, the Dutchman lost control of his car in turn 1 of Albert Park and ended up against the barriers, immediately causing a red flag that paralyzed the session. It was an unexpected accident, especially for a driver who for years has built his reputation precisely on consistency and the ability to control extreme situations. But the hardest thing was not only the impact against the wall, but the immediate consequence. Verstappen was eliminated in Q1 and condemned to start from the last place on the grid in the Australian Grand Prix. At that moment, the atmosphere inside the paddock changed completely. Throughout the preseason and the first signs of the year, there was already talk that Red Bull was not in the dominant position that it had maintained during previous seasons. Mercedes seemed to have made up ground, Ferrari was showing clear signs of progress, and McLaren continued to push forward with a very strong aerodynamic package. Therefore, seeing the main reference of the Austrian team out of the classification from the first round reinforced the narrative that was beginning to take hold in the championship. Red Bull was going from being the dominant hunter to becoming the team that now had to chase its rivals. Even Verstappen himself had admitted before the weekend that there was still a lot of work to be done for the car to go toe-to-toe with Mercedes and Ferrari. The situation became even more complex if we analyze the technical context of the season. The new cars, with more complex energy management and active aerodynamic systems, have created an environment where even the best drivers are still learning to interpret the real limits of the car. Verstappen himself acknowledged after the accident that the car's behavior had been extremely unpredictable, something he had not experienced before in his career. This further fueled doubts about the true potential of Red Bull in this new technical era, since if the team's most experienced driver had difficulty understanding the car in qualifying conditions, the race could become a real strategic challenge. The race began with a completely different scenario than Verstappen usually faces. Instead of starting from the first positions and controlling the pace from the start, the Dutchman found himself surrounded by the most chaotic part of the grid, where each meter gained requires a perfect combination of patience, precision and strategic reading. From the moment the traffic lights went out at Albert Park, it was clear that his objective was not to make desperate overtakes in the first corners, but rather to build a methodical comeback that would allow him to advance without compromising the race. In the first laps, he concentrated on avoiding incidents, knowing that traffic in the middle of the pack can ruin any recovery attempt if an unnecessary risk is taken. That decision was key because while several drivers aggressively fought for position, Verstappen began to slowly climb, taking advantage of every mistake by rivals and using the RB's constant pace to make his way. As the first stint progressed, something that Red Bull engineers had anticipated throughout the weekend began to emerge. The car was still not fully in its performance window. The RB showed nervous behavior when entering some corners, and the electrical energy management was not as efficient as that of its main rivals. For that reason, Verstappen had to drive with a much more calculated approach than usual. Instead of attacking each lap to the limit, the Dutchman prioritized the care of the tires and the stability of the car. accepting to lose a few tenths in certain sectors to maintain the balance of the car and prevent wear from triggering prematurely. This conservative approach, far from being a weakness, became one of the keys to the comeback, because it allowed the RB to maintain a consistent pace while other drivers began to suffer with degradation. The situation began to change in the second half of the race. With fuel dwindling and the car becoming lighter, engineers began adjusting engine maps and energy management in real time to optimize the car's performance. Little by little, Red Bull began to enter a much more stable operating zone. The electric power delivery was better synchronized with the overtaking zones, and the aerodynamic balance allowed you to attack the corners with greater confidence. It was at this point that Verstappen began to visibly increase the pace, setting increasingly competitive laps while continuing to overtake cars in the peloton. What at the beginning seemed like a simple survival race began to transform into a real comeback towards the important points. Meanwhile, the team context made what was happening on the track even more impressive. Red Bull was not having an easy weekend. The team's second car suffered technical problems that ended with an early abandonment, leaving all the responsibility of rescuing points on Verstappen's shoulders. In a championship that was shaping up to be extremely competitive against Mercedes and Ferrari, every point could make a difference in the long term. Therefore, each position won by the Dutchman had enormous weight for the team. Lap after lap, with clean overtaking and impeccable pace management, Verstappen approached the limit of what was possible that day. And when he finally crossed the finish line in 6th position, the result had a much greater meaning than the simple number that appeared on the table. It was confirmation that even in adverse conditions, the world champion was still capable of turning a disaster into a performance that forced the entire paddock to look again at Red Bull with respect. The outcome of the race in Australia left something much more important than a simple 6th place in the results table. When Verstappen crossed the finish line after starting from the last position on the grid, what seemed like a low-key race became a very clear signal to the entire paddock. It was not a chaotic comeback based on accidents or safety cars that altered the natural order of the competition. It was a recovery built step by step, with calculated overtaking, strategic pace management, and a perfect reading of how the car was evolving throughout the race. In other words, it was exactly the kind of performance that defines a world champion when the stage is not in his favor. The final result also revealed something fundamental about Red Bull's current moment. For much of the weekend, it was clear that the team did not have the fastest car in Melbourne. Mercedes managed to place its drivers at the top with a very solid performance, and Ferrari also showed a sufficient competitive level to fight for the podium area. That means Verstappen's 6th place finish wasn't the result of having a superior machine, but rather maximizing absolutely everything the RB could offer at the time. The context of the race itself demonstrates this. The team's other car abandoned due to technical problems, and Red Bull did not have the necessary pace to fight for victory. However, Verstappen managed to turn a situation that seemed like a total disaster into the maximum possible result under the circumstances. And that is precisely where the real concern appears for the rest of the teams. If Red Bull were dominating as in previous seasons, such a comeback could simply be interpreted as a reflection of a car far superior to the rest. But what happened in Australia was different. Verstappen's performance showed that even when the team is in the chase phase against rivals such as Mercedes and Ferrari, the Dutchman is still capable of rescuing results that keep the fight in the championship alive. That combination, a car that still needs development but a driver who maximizes every opportunity, is what makes Red Bull a dangerous rival even when it doesn't start as a favorite. In fact, the comeback left an implicit message that many within the paddock immediately interpreted. If Verstappen can transform an accident into qualifying, a start from last place and a car still outside its optimal window into a 6th place that adds important points, then the picture can change radically when the team finds the necessary improvements to stabilize the car. Because in that scenario, the equation once again tilts dangerously towards the side of the world champion. Australia was neither a victory nor a podium, but it was a silent warning to all those fighting for the championship. Red Bull may no longer dominate Formula One as before, but as long as Verstappen is behind the wheel, it will never stop being a real threat. Max Verstappen's comeback at the Australian Grand Prix wasn't just a good race, it was a stark reminder of why he remains the driver everyone fears behind him on the grid. What began as a completely disastrous weekend with an accident in Q1 that left him last on the grid ended up becoming a demonstration of intelligence, patience, and the ability to maximize every detail within the race. On a circuit where overtaking is complicated and where any mistake can ruin everything, Verstappen managed to build position after position until reaching 6th place, which, in the context of everything that happened, is worth much more than a few simple points in the standings. In other words, the Australian Grand Prix left a conclusion that resonated throughout the paddock. Red Bull may no longer be the most dominant car on the grid, the championship may have become more competitive and other teams may be stepping up. But as long as Max Verstappen is still behind the wheel, any race can become a threat to all those fighting for the title. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.